Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience. Tony. There's someone here to see you, the tough guard said as he entered his boss's office. The man was dressed in a black business suit and looked like a classic bodyguard from American movies. Yeah, who was it? Tony Shumilin, a well-known businessman and philanthropist in Priozersk, was just reviewing the reports of one of the charitable foundations he controlled. The rich man looked away from his papers for a moment and then quickly glanced at the guard towering in front of his desk. He answered immediately, giving Shumilin all the basic information about their uninvited guest. A man is here about the job. Despite his age, he looks sturdy enough, even though he looks like he's living in a squat. But he assures me that he can do the job you asked for. He really wants to come and see you. Tony thought for a second, and then, at the corner of his lips, a brief chuckle flashed. You say he looks like a homeless man? Oh, interesting. Shumilin habitually took a fountain pen in his hands and immediately made some notes in his diary. Well, invite him. Let's see what kind of candidate he is. The sturdy guard nodded and, with his hand to his earpiece, quickly informed his partner, who, being in the courtyard of the luxurious mansion, reacted instantly and let in a tall, gray-haired man whose frown was enough to make anyone shudder, even the seen and heard. Bullying gatekeeper who stately walked around the assigned territory at the gate every half an hour. You will be escorted, the guard briefly threw to the sullen man, pointing his hand toward a neatly dressed woman in her 40s. She, in turn, contemptuously pressed her overly provocative dark maroon lipstick. It was obvious that she did not like the guest immediately, but out loud, she just said, in a somewhat dismissive tone, "Please follow me. Tony really doesn't like to be kept waiting." The gray-haired man only smirked and replied sarcastically, "Don't be afraid, I won't run ahead of you. I didn't come out of the zoo." The businessman's housekeeper, not knowing how to respond to this insolence, simply strode up the stairs, gesturing for the visitor to follow her. The millionaire's mansion was located on a separate, well-protected territory. Next to the house, there was a beautiful dense forest, inside which there was even a small park for walks, which also belonged to Shumilin. Tony's office window had a wonderful view of a small river flowing past the rich man's property. On particularly sunny days, the water surface reflected a myriad of glittering reflections, making it seem as if a magical, shining stream lurked near the businessman's house. "Thank you, Elsa," said Shumilin as she brought him a visitor. "Tell me, how are things going with the lunch? My wife asked me to remind you. This time, the dishes should contain as many fresh vegetables as possible." Of course, Tony, the housekeeper, lowered her eyes. "Diana has already called. I personally told the cook all her wishes, including the mineral water. John needs to drink more rich fluids right now. By the way, has the water been delivered yet?" "Everything is waiting in the kitchen," the woman confirmed, and only after that the businessman let her go. "Well, come in, have a seat," Tony said, turning his attention to his guest. "If you would be so kind as to introduce yourself." "I'm Max," the man answered in a low voice, walked briskly to the chair offered by the rich man, and then sat down in it and folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Shumilin almost point blank, as if scanning him with his dark gray eyes, which made the businessman himself involuntarily want to look away. The guard was right. This Max looked as if he had lived on the street for years. The frayed old jacket had been darned and stitched in some places, and more than once. The jeans were decent looking, but there was a big hole in the left knee, and it was certainly not part of the designer's design. The skin on his hands and face was covered with a deep dark tan, so it was impossible to tell exactly how old he was. On the one hand, the man in front of him was clearly not young. Shumilin would give him exactly 55 years old. And on the other hand, the physical shape of the visitor could definitely give a head start to any 30-year-old. Even through the shabby shirt of dark green color, his chest muscles were showing through. The rich man could tell the same from a glimpse of his legs, sturdy with no hint of limpness or weakness. Shumilin himself had turned 54 this year, but he did not look as sturdy and lean as the man in the guest chair. For a second, Tony was even pricked by a thin needle of envy. Who would have thought that some bum, and probably with absolutely no money, could look much better than a millionaire who had every opportunity and means to do so? "So you're here about the job," looking intently at the frowning applicant, said Shumilin. At the same time, the rich man noted that his candidate, for all the hardships of life on the street, had fairly clean and neatly trimmed fingernails. Well, that's not bad, Tony thought to himself. Hygiene, after all, has never been done away with. "Yes, I saw your ad in the free paper. It said that you needed a strong and reliable helper for your sick son. So I'm here to work for you as a guide. Your son is blind, isn't he?" Tony looked at his guest with undisguised surprise, and then his lips, of their own accord, formed into an ironic grin. "Max, I don't know about your fatherly name, but are you sure you can handle it? Or you can call me by my last name, Max. That's what everyone I know calls me." Astonished at such simplicity bordering on tactlessness, Shumilin continued, choosing his words carefully. "All right, Max. Thank you for clearing this up for me right away. The thing is, my son is not blind," the businessman went on. "John, not so long ago, suffered from severe poisoning, and the doctors barely saved him. Unfortunately, the toxins had a serious impact on his lymphatic system, so that the complication went straight to the joints of the boy's legs." For the record, Shumilin held up his index finger. "My son is no longer a child. He turned 23 last year. So what my son needs now is a calm and easy-going man. Someone to help him get around on the street and go to the clinic where John is being treated. Why don't you hire a special staff from the hospital to babysit him?" Max wondered in turn. "He must be suffering all the time, poor guy." He said it angrily, with what seemed to the businessman to be sincere empathy for his son's condition. This pleased Tony very much. "That's the problem. My son himself doesn't want to be taken care of by medics. He says, 'I'm not an invalid. Why do I need nurses and Ives in the house?' John wants to feel independent, except that the physical restrictions he is now forced to observe are emotionally draining for my son. If you add to that the people in white coats running in and out of our house, I'm afraid John will fall apart. And the latter is incredibly important to us. Even his doctor says that the more positive emotions he has, the sooner he can say goodbye to the wheelchair and crutches forever." There was an awkward silence between the men for a moment, and then the businessman said quietly, "Think hard, Max. Will you be a worthy companion for my son? It's very important to me that you count on your own strength here, first of all, that you don't let John down." Max nodded confidently in response. "I can do it, Tony. I'll do whatever it takes to get your son back on his feet faster. You can count on me." Shumilin looked carefully at his guest one last time, then shrugged, signed some form on his desk, and said, "Well then, let's see you in action, Max. You start tomorrow. You will live directly in my house. I think you don't mind, do you?" "No, why not?" Max responded calmly. "I'm just glad I don't have to go out of town." Shumilin submitted a contract to him. "Great. Then sign here and here." He pointed to the blue-ticked boxes. "From now on, you are officially my son's associate." "Tax, that's great. Well now, let's go meet John. It's his day off and he's in his room." As they approached the room of the heir to Shumilin's business empire, he pointed to the door next door to his son's room. "You will live here, so that at any time, if Rhoda suddenly needs anything, you don't have to run up here from the first floor, but can safely come in from the next room. I'll tell the maid to make all the arrangements for you there." The man gently knocked on the beautiful door made of light wood. "John, my son, may I see you?" John Shumilin turned out to be a pleasant young man who, even while sitting in bed, managed to simultaneously hold video conversations with his father's partners, and write down in his own notebook key thoughts on the formation of the next quarter's business strategy. Max could not have imagined that this guy, full of vital energy, was now forced to move only with the help of others, or using crutches leaning on the bed. On the right side of Schumelen Jr.'s wide bed, stood an expensive wheelchair with a remote control. He didn't use it much now, but there were times when, without it, John couldn't even make it to the small in-house elevator at the end of the floor. "That's it, Jacob. I can't talk anymore. I'm sorry. Let's call again this afternoon. I'll give my father your thoughts on the new investment portfolio, okay?" John smiled at someone who was in the monitor of his silver laptop, and then he pressed the end button and closed the computer lid. "John, have you been working again?" With a slight reproach in his voice, my father said, "The doctor clearly told you to take as little exercise as possible, including intellectual one. Give your body a chance to recover properly." Tony walked across the room to his son and gently took the laptop from his hands. "Daddy, please," John exclaimed. "I'd die of boredom if I didn't get involved in our company too. How can Jacob pick the right stocks without me? He has absolutely no nose for analytics and long-term economic forecasts." However, the businessman was adamant and had no intention of leaving his son any work equipment. "I don't know anything, son. You need to rest before dinner." Only at that moment did the rich man remember that his new employee was still standing in the doorway of his son's room. "Oh, John, forgive me with this job. I've been falling out of reality." The businessman jokingly tapped his fist on his forehead and then gestured for Max to come closer. He calmly walked over to the bed of the young heir and held out his hand to the boy. "Max, your new companion and assistant," the gray-haired man said calmly and with dignity. John was somewhat confused, but responded to the offered handshake and then looked questioningly at his father. "Is that what I think it is, Dad? Will this man accompany me to the clinic and to rehab?" Max, at that moment, noticed the boy's unnatural pallor. Apparently, Schumelen was right when he said that the doctors had gone to great lengths to get his son out of the world. "That's right. Max will help you when needed. I had him set up a room next to yours." Schumelen hesitated for a moment and then, glancing at his watch, quickly spoke. "So I guess I could leave you two alone so you can get to know each other. If anything, I'm in my office. I have a few more reports to check and I'm running out of time. I'll see you at 3. 0 in the cafeteria?" "Of course, Father," John nodded. "Don't worry. I think we can find some common ground with Max." When he and Max were left alone, the rich man's son immediately set the record straight. "Don't think it's not forever. The doctor said that I would not be disabled, but the toxins must be completely eliminated from my body and all joint fluid. Then I will be able to walk again, like before." "I didn't doubt it," Max said calmly, and looked around John's room. Oddly enough, the young businessman's bedroom did not have a lot of fancy stuff or a huge walk. A closet with 100 business suits and a showcase of diamond cufflinks. If the young man's assistant did not know who was sitting in front of him now, he would have thought that Schumelen Jr. was just an ordinary guy. The only things that stood out in the room were a rack of stereo equipment, a record player, a small chest of drawers with a collection of vinyl discs, and a beautiful electric guitar hanging on a strap of genuine leather on a special metal fixture built right into the wall. "Are you into music?" Max remarked, and then cautiously approached the guitar. The instrument was beautifully made. Max himself knew it. "Yeah, a little bit," John answered simply. "Before, when I had more free time, I used to play something. I even made up some tunes. But after my father got me involved in his business, there wasn't much else to do." The companion turned to the guy. "What about sports? Exercise classes, running. Do you respect that?" John, instead of answering, pointed to his sore feet with an eloquent smile. "I don't know what I'm talking about. In the morning, I'd rather walk to the toilet by myself. No need to run. Although in the rehabilitation center, I work on special machines. It's the same as learning to walk again. And sometimes I get up on a treadmill under the supervision of a physiotherapist, but so far I can only crawl like a turtle, but I think everything is still to come." John and Max laughed together. Max liked the fact that Shumilin Jr. was so easy going and calm. To be honest, he was expecting to see some fastidious high school kid suffering from depression and hysterical fits. John, on the other hand, was very different, which gave the man hope that working with him would be easy. The son of a businessman said that from childhood he lived an ordinary life, except that his family had much more money than the parents of other classmates. "My father and mother worked hard all their youth, just to get back on their feet. Dad wasn't always such a famous businessman. He started with a very small office. He and his friends sold radio components. Then, when they were spinning out, he decided to rise to a higher level and began to develop design technologies, which he then offered to potential buyers, the owners of large radio and television communications networks. He was lucky enough to be noticed, and so it was on. John tried to put his feet on the floor on his own, but then a grimace of pain crossed his face. "You wait. Don't rush." Max came to his aid. "Let's go down slowly, one at a time. That's it. Try not to bend your knee at a right angle for less pain." "How do you know? Are you a rheumatologist?" "Rather, I've been through a knee problem myself, so I know exactly how you're feeling right now, and I know how to control your legs in your situation to minimize the pain. You don't have to rely on pills, do you?" The boy brushed a strand of blonde hair from his face and exhaled with relief when his feet finally touched the ground. "I can't even look at the vials and knives anymore, to be honest," he admitted. "But the doctors say I can't do without them." When the man and the young man went out into the corridor, Max helped the boy to keep his balance, and John confidently leaned on his crutches. The young man finished the story about his family. "My mother is a golden person. She has worked as a social worker all her life, and now that she has the opportunity to do so, she takes part in creating foundations and raising funds for sick people and those who are in a difficult life situation. You could say she is an extra-class volunteer." The boy smiled, and Max noted to himself how much he obviously loved his mother, since he spoke of her with such warmth. A phenomenon very rare for today's golden youth. They were already in their 30s when I was born. Well, after that it was the usual school, university. I studied in England, but my father wanted me to. He said it was the best education in the field of economics. "You don't sound too happy about this very education," Max remarked, pressing the red button of the elevator. "Well, what's there to be happy about?" John shrugged. "I understand that I needed this education like air. My father said he'd put me in charge of the company in less than 10 years. It's easy to imagine how foolish I would be to take over the reins and not have a clue about my future work." The elevator door opened softly, and a man and the young man stepped inside. At that moment, a text message arrived on John's phone. A quick glance at the sender's name, he smiled and shoved his cell phone deep into his jeans pocket. "I see you have a girlfriend, too." Hiding in the corners of his eyes a sparkling cunning, asked his companion. "I hope she's as smart as you are." "It's Lika," the boy answered briefly. "Don't talk about her in front of your father, or he'll start yelling again." Max gave his ward a questioning look, but refrained from further questioning. After all, it was none of his business, and what was outside Max's competence was of no interest to him. A little later, at dinner, Max, however, understood the reason for Shumilin Jr.'s reaction. Even though he was eating in the servants' kitchen, which was next door to the master's dining room, he could clearly hear the disgruntled voices coming from there, with Tony himself as the lead singer. "John, son, Bella complained about you again today," the businessman said indignantly. "She said you don't pick up the phone when she calls you, and you delete her messages right away." "Well, what's that all about, huh?" "Father, we've been over this 1,000 times," his son answered coldly. "I don't like Bella, and I'm not going to resume any kind of relationship with her. I didn't want to marry her before all this, and I won't change my mind now. And what kind of marriage can we talk about when I can barely walk?" Any retired grandfather could outrun me in 5 minutes. Tony looked sternly at his stubborn offspring. You're wrong, John. You're wrong. You see, Bella is not some girl off the street. She can't be shaken off her mitts like in the fairy tale. Bella is the daughter of our old friends and one of our most reliable business partners. Remember how Uncle Emmanuel used to ride you around his neck when you were a child? And how many birthday presents did he give you and Bella? The ones with a hint, remember. Emmanuel Vaganovich is a very honest and far-sighted man. You weren't even 4 years old when we agreed to intermarry and merge the business. And that's a perfect match for you. What's wrong with Bella, son? She's an Oxford graduate for a second. Oxford? Tony meaningfully shook his fork in the air with a piece of perfectly baked trout strung on it. John stared sadly at the fish, then said sadly, That's the thing, Dad. You and Mom have always decided everything for me. Who I was going to be when I grew up, who I was going to be friends with. And now you're taking over my personal life. John, honey, Diana tried to reason with her son. And on the other hand, what's wrong with that when we've been looking for the most suitable girl for you? If you tried to look at many things a little more globally, his mother finally found the right word. You would realize that your father and I were always trying to protect you from possible mistakes. Mistakes? The boy grinned bitterly. In fact, I've never even had the chance to make those mistakes in my life. Do you know what I really love, Mother? Music. And the girl I want to marry loves it too. You say you have to look at things more globally, right? But if that were true, you would have realized long ago that I only started to study economics because my father's company's situation demanded it. If I really had any choice in life, I would have chosen to become a famous music producer, or in general, to write music myself. Oh, John, you're breaking my heart, Diana exclaimed and clutched her chest demonstratively. Well, look at you, boy. What you're driving your mother to, Tony said sternly, and poured his beloved wife a glass of water. And if by a girl who also likes music, you mean you're leaky, you don't even have to go on. Don't expect me to let you two get married? Daddy, why? My son looked at him incredulously. You know how she feels about me, don't you? Leica and I have real feelings, and she's willing to help me and support me always, whether I can walk or not. And this Bella, if you pray for her, has never visited me in the hospital after the poisoning. She calls every time with the sole purpose of finding out if I walked on my own feet. I guess she's afraid she'll be forced to marry a handicapped man. With these words, John picked up his crutches and with difficulty rose from his desk and slowly moved toward the elevator. Son, we're not done with this conversation, the businessman warned him. The young man turned to his family. Mom, Dad, I love you very much. I really do. But I'm not going to let you interfere in my life anymore and mold me into whatever you want me to be. I want to be me, you know, me. Thank you for lunch. It was delicious. I think I'll rest in my room for a while. I'm tired. And the guy quietly walked out of the dining room. Max, sitting in the small kitchen for house staff, only sighed heavily. Oh, never mind, said Astor, the local gardener. They're always fighting about it. You don't need any television. You see the Spanish passion's going on over there. It's just like us, ordinary people. She and John had managed to cross paths somewhere. I see, the companion responded thoughtfully and put his plate in the sink. Max, are you finished? Suddenly, a thin, unpleasant voice came from behind Max. When the man turned around, he saw the housekeeper, Elsa, looking at the new employee of their house with contempt. In her hands, she was holding a bundle. Yes. Is there anything you need help with? Max asked her. No. Thank you very much. She gritted her teeth and tossed Max a small cloth bundle with clean clothes in it. This is for you, said the housekeeper grudgingly. Tony told you to put on anything fresh. After all, you're living in a civilized society now, not in a heating pipe. Would you be so kind as to change your clothes now? Well, if the owner himself asks, that's another matter. The guide answered her calmly. Would you, my dear, cool down a little bit? You walk around like a hot stove and you can't wait till somebody gets burnt on you. You know what they say about such hot ladies? Elsa flared up, then whispered furiously, How dare you? Rude. After that, she turned abruptly on her heels and walked out of the kitchen. The last thing Max heard before he went to his room was Savely's quiet laughter. From that moment on, Elsa began to constantly eschew in Max's direction. Not a day went by that the strange woman did not impute to John's assistant some misstep, or did not point out his bad behavior. In such cases, Max tried either to keep his dignity and keep silent, or to make jokes without spite, but so as to put the obnoxious housekeeper in her place. After all, though the guide was mostly taciturn, he was not going to tolerate obvious mockery of himself. One day, as he walked past his immediate supervisor's office, Max overheard Tony complaining, Please, Mr. Schumelin, but this is becoming simply impossible. You should look closely at this Max. He has eyes like a maniac or the last thief. This is not my business, of course, but if I were in Diana's place or John's, I would not be so quick to blindly believe this man. After all, they say that a street dog is only good as long as he is fed. And when he doesn't like what he has to like, he'll hound the naughty owner to death. Elsa, calm down. What are you so nervous about? The businessman calmly objected to her and then smiled slyly. Maybe Astor was telling the truth yesterday. Can you imagine he seriously believes that you, how should I put it delicately, show such an unusual way of sympathy to my son's companion? The housekeeper's face twisted momentarily, as if the owner had just told her that she had eaten a cockroach. Tony, you're a well-mannered, cultured man. Why do you listen to some gardener's nonsense? His business is trimming plants and taking care of flowers. Well, I'll tell him for that separately. And to tell you the truth, Tony, you should be sent to the neck of your guide. Look at him. He's already upset half the staff with his actions. Shumilin theatrically rolled his eyes to the ceiling. He was beginning to get tired of his housekeeper's endless complaints. Elsa, I assure you, so far, the only person in the house who has had a complete disconnect with Max is yourself. And please stop catching me on my legitimate break. Just because I ask you to bring me coffee doesn't mean I want to talk to you about all the gossip of my workers. But Tony, the housekeeper tried to say something else, but the millionaire interrupted her sharply. That's enough. You're a woman, after all. Well, is it so hard for you to get through to a man? Yes, Max is a peculiar man. He's not very sociable, but you'd better try. Elsa blushed with anger, but uttered only a subdued, As you wish, Mr. Schumann. I understand you. After that, she quickly left her master's office. Max, who became an unwitting witness to this conversation, barely had time to take cover in the cleaner's utility room, so that the housekeeper did not have time to notice the guide. Meanwhile, Max himself continued to support John in everything. He traveled with him to the hospitals, helped him with his training in the rehabilitation center, and, in general, behaved like a kind older friend. The wise and sensible man became almost a friend to the young man, despite the fact that he was old enough to be his father. Sometimes John himself was surprised at how strong and sturdy Max was for his rather mature years. However, the companion, in response to this, only grinned. That's why I do not tell anyone my patronymic. I do not want to be considered an old man. I still feel young myself, and the body can always be trained, regardless of age. Max almost never said anything about his past life. All his ward knew was that Max had lived on the street for a very long time, and the man had had to, literally, survive. The latter often manifested itself in his habit of collecting and storing food in his room, for which he regularly received a reprimand from Anna, a young maid whose passion for cleanliness and order inevitably suggested that she had certain psychological problems. Otherwise, the guide could not understand how one could explain her irrepressible energy in everything that concerned cleaning, washing, and ridding all the furniture of the ubiquitous dust particles. Max, You're at it again. How many times have I told you that fruit and cookies should not be taken outside the kitchen? They are, after all, everywhere full of crumbs, and who hides bread under the pillow? You don't live in a prison. If you want a snack, our common fridge is always open. Within reasonable limits, of course. Max, however, was not at all offended by the pretty maid's words. He just shrugged his shoulders and answered briefly, "Forgive me, darling. I have such a Bjong nature, always ready to shove everything and more in my pockets. I didn't do it on purpose." "I understand." Anna nodded good-naturedly and was sweeping the rest of the garbage into a small bucket. "Just please, in the future, try to somehow tame your nature, okay? Otherwise, I still have 2 floors to clean, and I would like to be free tonight." Max assured her that he would try not to hide any more breadcrumbs and cookies in his room. And then he would go to John's room to see how he was doing, and just to talk. Now they often talked. Max appreciated the young man's ability not to talk too much among his friends and relatives, and therefore at some point was able to trust him, and tell him a little more about his former life. "You, John, are, in fact, my last chance," Max told him once, in a burst of candor. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to live a human life again before I met you." "Was it that bad?" He looked at his companion gravely, and the boy asked him. "Yeah." Max stretched out and hunched over as if to shut himself off from the world around him. At that moment, he really looked his real age. "Once upon a time, a long time ago, I was normal too," the guy told him. "I thought I'd have a family, kids." The man sighed heavily. "And then, in an instant, everything fell apart. My wife, Angela, had an accident at work. That's how you might say it all started." Max nervously rubbed his palms as if he suddenly felt very cold. "I started drinking. A lot. I drank so much that I didn't remember how I ended up on the other side of town, and there was no point in going home. The apartment was empty and lonely anyway, without Angela. That's when the black realtors came after me. They said, 'Why do you need such a big apartment all by yourself, man? Wouldn't it be better to have your own house in the countryside?' Now I understand that they drugged me, otherwise I wouldn't have signed those goddamn papers." "After that, you ended up on the street?" John asked him sympathetically. "Well, yes," Max answered. "And so I began to drink, then to juggle. Once in a while, I got a job at the train station as a loader. There they paid more, and I could do something useful all night without drinking. I used to work as a loader at the station where they paid me a salary and I could do something useful for the night and not drink. And you ask how I got such a figure?" The man grinned. "You just try to survive and not to die of hunger as much as possible." The guy patted his companion's hand with sincere sympathy. In his eyes, Max could see the genuine pain. John was a deeply sensitive person from childhood, a trait passed down to him from his mother. And now, being the owner of an empathic and sensitive nature, the guy seemed to want to take upon himself all the bad things that happened to his wonderful assistant. "Max, you should know that I have never judged you, and I never will. We all have our own backpack of secrets behind us. It's very hard for me to realize right now that this is happening in our lives. Do you know how many times I've put myself in the shoes of those poor kids whose parents have to raise money for their treatment? My father sponsors several charities, and when I was little, he took me there many times. I saw everything. Their eyes and the eyes of their loved ones, full of despair, hopelessness, and hope. Hope that it could all be over if they could just raise the necessary amount of money. It was the same with my mother. She took me to the homeless shelters, and I saw how envious they looked at everyone who was luckier than they were." "Thank you for understanding," Max nodded. "Maybe that's why you grew up to be such a normal guy. That despite your wealth, you saw the other side, the underside of society and human life in general." John shook his head negatively. "You don't get it, Max. When I saw all these people, I asked myself only one question." "Which one?" After a few seconds of silence, the guide asked. "You wouldn't believe it. Sadness flashed across the young man's face. I asked myself why I was lucky in this life and they weren't. What does it have to do with it? Why can I have everything I need for a good and comfortable existence, and they can't even spend the next night under the roof? Max looked at the boy warmly. Don't torture yourself. No one knows the answers to these questions. You'll only chew yourself up from the inside with these thoughts, and they won't do you any good. It's a blessing to realize that there is another life beyond the gates of your palace. Your mother and father, they hold you too tightly in their fist, but they're good. They're good because they help people like us, not with words, but with deeds. That alone, believe me, John, is worth a lot. On an impulsive impulse, the young son of a businessman hugged his companion tightly. At that moment, it seemed to him that he had truly met his soulmate, a soulmate who is well aware of the heat of passion and all sorts of philosophical thoughts, raging in the head of a very young Schummelin. 3 weeks later, Max stood in front of Tony in his office and argued to him the need to get a guard dog. Max, of course, I'm ready to help you in everything that concerns my son's health. But, pardon me, why do we need a dog? Sincerely, the businessman didn't understand his employee. Archie and Frank are perfectly capable of performing their duties. It's not for nothing that they were trained at the military base. But there's only 2 of them in the whole estate, Max agreed. And besides, you're surrounded by woods. There's no telling who might come from there. And besides, you've got woods nearby. There's no telling who might come from there. And the dog, again, can be trained. So it, with its barking, warned your guys in advance which way to run. And in general, with a house like yours, without a good dog just cannot. I already have one good dog in mind. An acquaintance recently called from the kennel, offering to just pick him up. Schummelin Sr. scratched at the back of his head with a ballpoint pen at a loss. Well, if you think that we really need it so vital, then... The rich man threw up his hands, but I warn you at once, you take the dog under your own responsibility. If something goes wrong with him, you first of all will be responsible. I, for my part, told John about the dog, and he was very much in favor of it. It would be good for him to work with the animal, too, and he might be on the mend sooner. He is so good, he's even, without crutches, little by little began to move. It is true, very carefully, and within his room. But to me it seems things are going well. Tony even crossed himself 3 times. Thank God my prayers have been answered. I have to tell my wife before she goes away on business again. Thank you, Max, for taking such good care of my son. If it weren't for you, I don't even know if he would have recovered in such record time. The next day, Max brought a new 4-legged guest into the house and solemnly introduced him to all the residents of the manor. John was indeed delighted with the dog. A German shepherd named Taylor immediately recognized the boy as his new master, on a par with Schummelin Sr. and Max. Smart and cheerful, the dog barked happily, running in circles around the yard, and then ran up to the men, the owners of the house, and happily licked their hands or stood on his hind legs to smack Tony on the nose. Wow, he's a big beast. The businessman swayed under the weight of the dog and said, Max, how old is he anyway? 2 years, replied the guide with a smile. You're still young, you'll serve faithfully for a long time. Elsa was the only one who was not happy to have a dog in the house. Well, here's another dirty monster brought into the house. She wrinkled her nose at the gardener, standing in front of the pantry door. Only this time it's shaggy, too. You shouldn't do that to him, Elsa, Astor said reproachfully. The man is trying to do what he wants to do best. And John Evgenievich under him has noticeably improved. You'll see, we'll get into more trouble with your guide. The woman threw him angrily, and then disappeared into the depths of the storeroom. A week later, the entire Schummelin family was invited to the celebration of Emmanuel's anniversary, the same one whose daughter John had been so persuaded by his parents to marry. As the celebration threatened to drag on into the morning, the rich men decided to give almost all of their house staff the day off. The gardener and the maid went home to see their families and spend the day in a domestic atmosphere. Only Max and Taylor remained at the Shumilan estate, and the housekeeper Elsa and her 2 guards. Late at night, when no one was in the house anymore, a terrible thing happened. 3 muggers mordeurs somehow penetrated into the territory of the mansion and quietly got into the territory of the mansion and quietly got into the house using the premises of the basement, where there was an underground garage and exit to the elevator leading directly into the lobby of the house. Max, who was resting in the garden at that time, heard strange rustles from the eastern side of the fence in time, quietly calling the sheepdog, who at that moment was just settling for the night in her new kennel. Max cautiously followed all 3 of them. Judging by their clothes and movements, the work in this case was clearly done by professionals. Dark clothing and tight-fitting masks made the villains almost invisible in the darkness of the autumn evening. They had bags of bounty sticking out from behind their shoulders, and knives with perfectly sharpened blades were gleaming in their hands. "What's the matter? I don't understand," Max whispered to the dog. "Where are Frank and Archie?" Sneaking along the wall, Max quickly found the answer to his question. Both guards were lying next to each other. They were unconscious. Checking the men's pulse, the guide made sure they were alive. Max silently followed the robbers, Clever Dog walking silently beside them. After taking the elevator to the first floor, Max and Taylor cheerfully greeted the burglars. "Good evening, guys. Why are you working here without lights? You won't be able to carry the most important things." All 3 slowly turned in his direction. "Oh, is that the old clown? Get rid of him, brothers. We don't want to leave any witnesses here." 2 tall, powerful men drew knives from behind their belts and rushed at the guide and his dog. But Max was not as simple as he wanted to make himself out to be. By applying some confident pain, grabs to the villains, and by kicking them in the jaw and groin, Max was able to dislodge the weapons from their hands. Taylor grabbed the 3rd bastard in the leg, and a bright light flashed across the room. "What in God's name is going on here?" Elsa shouted, dressed in her nightrobe, but Max could see the unconcealed anger and frustration flickering in the housekeeper's eyes. "Get out of here, you bald sheep! Before we kill you too," he shouted, and then threw his knife straight at Max, at the same time throwing the dog away. The unbearably white light of the lamp blinded Max for just a fraction of a second, but, alas, it was enough. By drawing a clear, straight line in the air, the knife plunged into the brave guide's chest. Choking on the pain and the salty taste in his mouth, Max slowly settled to the floor. Elsa screamed, throwing her hands up to her face, which was twisted and white as chalk, when police sirens were heard in the courtyard. It turned out that it was the Shumilan's neighbors who, upon hearing the screams and the dog's menacing barking in the middle of the night, had called the police and, at the same time, the ambulance. A SWAT team arrived, along with the police, and the first thing the medics did was rush to Max, who was on the brink of life and death. He was quickly loaded onto a stretcher, as were the 2 guards. Frank and Archie were victims of a massive dose of sleeping pills that could prove fatal to the men if proper detoxification measures were not taken in time. "What's going on here, in my absence?" Shumilan, who drove up to his mansion at the same time, asked in amazement. Neighbors guessed a call, and the owner of the estate. He, learning that his house was attacked, immediately took off from the anniversary and arrived at the scene of dramatic events, leaving his wife and son at the party. The businessman wanted to get to the bottom of what had happened in person. "What are you doing? Where are you taking him?" asked the rich man 2 doctors who were just loading a stretcher with the wounded Max into the ambulance. "He's got a serious stab wound. It's a matter of minutes." One of the medics pushed the businessman's arm away. "We're not sure we can save him. The blood loss is too great. Take him to the second city hospital." Shumilan pressed the doctors. "Don't worry about the rest. I have my own people there. Do everything you can to make sure this man survives. He risked his life trying to protect my property." The medic only nodded briefly, and the doors of the ambulance slammed in front of the businessman's nose with a loud clanking sound. Tony quickly dialed the number of a surgeon he knew at the same clinic. Arranging the operation with him, the millionaire did not hesitate for a minute to get into his car and followed the ambulance. When the businessman arrived at the clinic, the first thing he did was rush to the gurney that was carrying the unfortunate guide to the operating room. "Tony," Max whispered with bloodless lips. "It's Elsa." Her eyes, anger, only anger in them. Max lost consciousness, and the incomprehensible millionaire was horrified to see how the grey wig suddenly slipped off the guide's head. Under it was short, cropped, dark-haired hair. Tony Schumaline. Some unfamiliar young man approached him, then showed him his police ID. "Captain Dexter, I think you and I have a lot to talk about." "See, course," said Schumaline, stammering as he continued to stare at Max's wig in bewilderment. Dexter took him to an empty room where he sat him on an empty bed. "Calm down, Tony. Max is a member of our staff. It would be more correct to say Lieutenant Colonel M." "What?" The businessman couldn't believe his ears. "Are you saying that my son's companion is a policeman? What is this nonsense?" "It's not nonsense," the captain answered him calmly. "Max has been working undercover for a long time. It's his professional thing, if you will." Dexter smiled proudly. He'd been a lot of things during his service. Homeless, a theater worker. He'd even played a hitman once, but in your case, he needed to break into the estate with a realistic legend. "But why?" Schumaline was perplexed. "For you and your son. Max had to work for a gang of burglars who for a very long time have been committing, like this audacious raid on the homes of wealthy citizens. Your guards, they were drards. They were drugged with strong sleeping pills. And as for John, do you remember the circumstances under which he was poisoned?" The businessman remembered the details of that ill-fated day. Of course it was. It was very hot. It was July after all. Rhoda got some poor quality juice. Elsa immediately threw away the whole bag so that, God forbid, no one else would get hurt. But we were scared out of our wits. The doctors had been trying to cure my son for hours. Dexter smirked meaningfully. "Originally she poured juice for everyone in the family, didn't she?" "What are you implying?" "It took the rich man a while to figure it out, but then it hit him. Do you think Elsa could have known that the juice was poisoned? And not just know, but—" "She herself put the poison in it," said the policeman, like a coot-off. "Elsa is a professional tipster, a member of the same gang. A former nurse, she is very good at making deadly cocktails of all kinds of drugs, so that then it is almost impossible to prove that the person died or suffered from unnatural causes. She brought poisoned tea to your guys and poured such a dose of it that they almost gave their souls to God, and they would not have been saved." "So my housekeeper is a murderer then?" "I'm afraid so." The captain nodded at him. "We've had a few cases like that before. Only it ended in a much sadder way. No one in the family survived. And your son, apparently, had not much to drink, and the doctors invested in saving him full, so that John, as you might say, was born with the shirt off his back. You are incredibly lucky that this time you had Max in the house with you." "We were all at the Jubilee," replied Schumaline sullenly. "On the contrary, I blame myself for not figuring out Elsa in time. And she kept complaining to me about Max, as she felt that his appearance in the house could disrupt her evil plans. I'll tell you right away. She had a special revenge on the infirm and meticulous guide. It was not for nothing that the housekeeper set her knife-wielding thugs on Max. She gave her accomplices the access codes to the gate leading to the underground parking lot, and from there they got into the house. Well, when the fight broke out, the housekeeper only needed to play a comedy in front of the security cameras to create an alibi, but things did not go according to plan. God, what a horror. Tony clasped his hands over his face. Don't kill yourself, the policeman patted him on the shoulder. After all, remember, it could have ended a lot worse. At that moment, The men noticed doctors rushing in and out of the intensive care unit behind the door of the room where they were sitting. There, at that moment, the best surgeons in the city were fighting for Mac's life. "It won't work if we don't give him a blood transfusion," said the surgeon who operated on the guide policeman after a while. "Except that his group and phenotype are very rare. Group 4, negative rhesus. Where are we going to find one now?" Then the millionaire's face brightened. "You will, doctor. I have the same blood type and a factor." The surgeon turned to the businessman in surprise. "Are you sure?" With a doubtful look at Shumilin, the doctor asked again. "Absolutely," he nodded. "Let's do this as quickly as possible. I want the man who saved my family to live." During the transfusion, the surgeon secretly did a comparative DNA test of both men's blood. It was all too rare in his medical career to see such amazing coincidences. When everything was ready, the surgeon could not believe his eyes. "My God! But this is impossible." God works in mysterious ways. Indeed. When Max felt considerably better, the doctor approached Shumilin and showed him the results of the examination. "The probability of kinship is 99 and 9/10%, the businessman said with one lip, then turned to the doctor. "There can be no mistake." "No." He shook his head. "If science says that you and Lieutenant Colonel Max are brothers, then you are." Tony silently squeezed the test. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Bringing his son into the room with the recovering policeman, the man gathered his courage before showing the papers to Max and John. "But how is that possible? I've always been an only child in my family for as long as I can remember." Although the policeman's face went pale. "God." And then the businessman Shumilin began his story. "I always knew that I was not my parents' son. They took me from the orphanage when I was very young, right after my own mother died after giving birth. However, in the family where my biological mother lived, there was another boy, my older brother. That's you, Max." The millionaire looked at the policeman. The man's chest, from which the doctors had, with such difficulty, pulled a huge knife, was now tightly bandaged. "Of course, my parents didn't tell me anything until the last moment," Shumilin continued. "It was only much later, when I was already an adult, that I found out that I had an older brother somewhere. Max was older than me by exactly 1 year. He was raised by my aunt, Aglaia, my mother's sister." Tony looked first at his son and then at Max. "Why didn't you look for him?" John asked, turning to his father. "Now that Tony told me about it, I'm beginning to understand something. Aunt Aglaia raised me. It's true, but she never told me that I had a brother. After the army, I went straight to police school, so I became a police officer. And Aglaia told me only before she died that she was forced to keep quiet about the second boy. It was sort of the only condition for those rich parents to be able to adopt my little brother. Otherwise, she would have had to put up with Tony being raised in an orphanage. Of course, she didn't want that fate for him, so she agreed, and she couldn't afford 2 of them at the time. We always lived very poorly, so I do understand that Aglaia then wanted to do what was best for Tony." Max sighed heavily. "When I found out about Tony, I was already in my 30s. Well, who and how would I look for? Especially at the time, I already knew about the adoption. So fate scattered me and my little brother. And then this gang. I wanted to make this the last case of my career. I'm tired of chasing bad guys. What can I say? Now it looks like my dream will come true, just not quite the way I'd like it." Max said that the accomplices, with the help of their pseudo-economist Elsa, had already cleaned out several respectable families in this way. Each time the MO was the same. Either they robbed when no one was in the house and then everything was done quickly, quietly, and without casualties, or if the family could not be lured out, the unfortunates would be poisoned en masse. The latter should have happened to the Shumilins, but John unwittingly took all the blow and at the same time scared away the housekeeper for a while. Nevertheless, the loot was too fat to leave it like that, and then Elsa had a new plan, which helped Max and the dog Taylor. Now, all the burglars would receive decent sentences. And of course, she got the most. She had, with her own hands, taken the lives of more than 10 people. When Max finally recovered and left the hospital, his newfound family was waiting for him. His millionaire brother Tony and his nephew John, with whom, by that time, he had already managed to become really close, though he did it in the form of a Bjong guide. Crying, Max hugged both of his loved ones and happily uttered, "Finally, we are together, my dears. You would not believe how thankful I am that God sent me to your house. Max, darling, how glad we are." Shimmerlin exclaimed in response, "You saved our lives, all three of us, John and Diana. Where would we be now if it were not for you?" The men embraced tightly again, an embrace imbued with the incredible power of familial love and sincere human happiness. Max resigned from the force. He was sent off with great honor, and though wounded, they threw such a farewell party that the local police station will remember it for a long time to come. Now Max lives with his brother and nephew, and of course his dog Taylor, who has become very attached to the retired lieutenant colonel. Max never tires of training him, thereby working out his own damaged muscles. The man is quite confident that he will soon be able to return to normal life again. John fully recovered after 6 months and was able to put his crutches in the storeroom. Now he hoped for good. All this time he had been visited by Leica, the same girl from the poor family against whom the businessman and his wife had been so determined. However, as soon as they saw the sincere dedication with which this fragile and pretty girl was caring for their son, the icy crust of prejudice in their hearts melted away. Tony personally blessed the couple and wished the future newlyweds to never lose their freshness and respect for each other. Both he and his wife saw their son literally shine in Leica's presence, so they didn't want to ruin their tender, so real happiness. John and his fiancée were married just 3 months later. Now Leica is expecting her first child, and she hopes very much that he will combine all the best qualities of her favorite man: the kindness and love of her husband, the intelligence and love of her husband, the intelligence and foresight of her father-in-law, and the incredible courage and strength of spirit of his brother, Max.